I'm Matt Crowley with Venture Capital Press, and today we're going to be doing part 2 on venture capital due diligence. So this would be the diligence that an investor, whether it's an angel investor or a venture capital firm, would be doing on your startup. So part 1 we talked about financial due diligence. This section we're going to talk about contractual due diligence and intellectual property due diligence. So what do those terms mean? Well, remember from part 1, as an angel investor or a venture capital firm, they're going to be very interested in understanding who your startup is and what kind of risks are inside it. They also want to prove that the things that you've told them about your startup are actually true. So from a contract standpoint, the investor wants to understand if you actually have customers, what do those relationships look like? Does a customer have a contract to license your software, but it's only on a trial basis and they're not paying you? Is it only for 30 days at a time? Or is it some big 3-year license and they're paying you a bunch of money up front to do some development on the software and then have the customer use it for a long time? Is the customer expecting that they own the software after you develop it? Do they have any rights to the intellectual property? Same thing with hardware, same thing with services. If, as a lawyer, I'm going to offer up an engagement letter as a contract, then it's going to explain what services I'm providing, for how long, and whether I'm doing it or my junior lawyer's doing it. Same thing will be true for your business. And so the investor wants to understand, how many customers do you have? If you say, well, we don't have contracts with any of them, that makes you look risky. If you tell the investor that, well, we have contracts, but basically the investor just, the customer hits I agree on a button on your website, that's okay. That's a contract too, but what the customer is agreeing to is a contract that gets called your terms of service or your terms and conditions. And so now they're going to want to look at that. That'll be your customer agreement. They'll also want to see what your contracts are like with your vendors. So you said that you have an agreement with someone to maintain your servers. Where is that agreement? What happens if that person doesn't show up on a Tuesday? Are there penalties? Do we have the ability to terminate that person? If you say that you have a joint venture agreement with Cisco or Oracle, they would like you to prove that, because sometimes in the world of startups and founders, when I say as a startup founder that I have an agreement with Cisco, what I really meant was I had a conversation with them over a cup of coffee and they said they were sort of interested in what I'm working on. That's not a customer contract. The investor wants to know whether your agreement with a vendor or with a customer is real or whether we haven't actually signed it yet. Same thing when it comes to a memorandum of understanding or a letter of intent. That's just an agreement to agree at some point, and that's interesting. At least you got that far with the vendor or the customer, and that's important for the investor to know, but it's not the same as a binding agreement. So these are the things that an investor is interested in. They also want to know, what kind of live agreements do you have? So you may shake your head and say, what does that mean? Well, if I had an agreement with Cisco and it expired in 2016, that isn't very useful to me. That tells me that there may be a problem, because why did Cisco go away? But you can't count Cisco as a vendor or a customer if you don't have a current agreement with them. And if the idea is that the agreement on paper expired in 2016, but you're still working together, before you go to investors, you probably want to get an amendment or something that explains that that relationship is still live, to try to head off that question. So the financial projections, income statement, balance sheet, customer contracts, vendor contracts are all very interesting to a potential investor. Pretty much every business has some form of intellectual property, whether it be trademarks, copyrights, patents, or just trade secrets that they want to keep from their competitors and sometimes from their customers and vendors. So from an intellectual property standpoint, imagine that you're starting a software company. You'll have created code. So the investor will be interested in, have you actually finished the code? Who made the code? So were they employees of your company or were they independent contractors? If it's a consulting firm that built all of your code, how do we know that you actually own the code and not the consulting firm? So there should be some sort of consulting agreement that explains, no, they did the work as a work made for hire, they got paid, and as soon as they got paid, our startup now owns the code, no questions asked, no other uses. That sort of thing is very important. And there should also be agreements with employees that explains that as an employee that your startup owns everything that they did for you at their job. And there's another webinar specifically on that if you want to go into detail. But long story short, the lawyers for the angel band or for the venture capital firm, their lawyers are going to want to see a chain of title. So from the day that the code was created, who created it? Do they own it? Do we own it? If we license the code to somebody else, is it made clear that we only gave them a license and they have no ownership rights? Or if we bought code from somebody else, did we confirm that when we bought it that they actually owned it? Those are all things that the investor wants to think about. So some of that may sound like an ice cream headache, but now at least you're aware of what the investors are looking for and why. Thanks very much. We hope you enjoyed this episode.